Tantor Audio presents The King's Grave, the discovery of Richard III's lost burial place and the clues it holds, by Philippa Langley and Michael Jones, narrated by Corrie James. Preface. On 22 August 1485, two armies faced each other at Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. King Richard III of the House of York lined up in battle against his rival to the throne, Henry Tudor, a clash of arms that would determine the fate of England. It was Tudor who won the victory. Richard was cut down after leading a cavalry charge against his opponent and killed in savage fighting, after being only a few feet away from Henry himself. He was the last English king to die in battle. That year marks a pivotal date in our history books, the ending of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. The House of Tudor became one of our most famous ruling dynasties, and its 118-year triumph culminated with William Shakespeare's history plays. Within them, Richard III emerged as one of England's most consummate and appalling villains, a ruthless plotter, an outcast from his own family, deformed in body and nature, who murdered his way to the throne. The most horrifying of these crimes was the killing of the young nephews placed in his care, the princes in the Tower. In Shakespeare's Richard III, the king's own death at Bosworth is powerfully portrayed. Alone, with no means of escape, and surrounded by his enemies, Richard calls out, "A horse! A horse! My kingdom for a horse!" His despairing cry is not heeded, and he is overpowered and slain. It is the judgment of God upon his wickedness. Shakespeare's drama was based on a series of Tudor histories that progressively blackened Richard's name. The principal charge against him in the reign of Henry VII was that he had seized the throne by killing his nephews. That ghastly accusation, believed by many, should have been enough to consign him to the scrap-heap of history. But by the reign of Henry VIII, he had already been accused of a number of additional crimes, including disposing of his brother George, Duke of Clarence, in the most startling fashion, drowning him in a large vat of Malmsey wine. By the reign of Elizabeth I, it was commonly believed that he had poisoned his own wife. It is striking how the Tudors kept adding to Richard's tally of victims. Alongside this was an almost compulsive need to distort his appearance, a physical characteristic where one shoulder was raised higher than the other was deliberately exaggerated in a succession of Tudor portraits to depict the king in increasingly sinister fashion. By the time of Shakespeare, this propaganda had reached its zenith. Richard had now become a crouching hunchback, whose bent and distorted body mirrored the hideous depravity of his crimes. By then the king's actual body, buried hastily in Leicester in the aftermath of the Battle of Bosworth, had disappeared from view. It was widely believed that the disgraced monarch's humble grave in the church of the Greyfriars had been lost at the time of Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, its contents even emptied into the river Soar. With the king's remains seemingly absent, the Tudors further twisted his historical reputation. He grew into a dark Machiavellian figure, an outcast from all sensibility, whose life and death provided a terrible moral warning. It was a damning indictment, yet some were suspicious. Early in the reign of James I, a number of attempts were made to present an alternative, redeeming portrait of the vilified king. Such efforts have persisted to this day, with the founding of the Richard III Society, determined to present a more human and sympathetic picture of Richard as man and monarch. More recent academic studies have modified the Tudor legend in some respects. Yet, despite all these efforts, Shakespeare created a play so sinister and darkly seductive that it still remains the portrait most are drawn to. Shakespeare's powerful and unsettling depiction of a man beyond the moral pale gained new currency when it was transformed into the Sir Laurence Olivier film in 1955. It has been long recognised that only a discovery as important as Shakespeare's drama is compelling would provide a counterpoint to the Tudor villain the playwright portrayed. Now, in a municipal car park in Leicester, that discovery has been made. The grave of Richard III has been found, with the king's body still within it. It is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of recent history. This book reveals the remarkable series of events that led to this astonishing find. It tells of a search for Richard's remains, and also, accompanying it, the search for his real historical reputation. For before the remnants of his body were uncovered, permission was obtained by Philippa Langley for them to be laid to rest in a proper and fitting reburial in Leicester Cathedral. Here at last was an opportunity to step beyond Shakespeare and make peace with the most vilified of our rulers, not to condemn him, nor to sanitize his actions, but to place him firmly back in the context of his times. As Richard's bones were painstakingly examined, it was found that he had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that would have left one shoulder higher than the other. It also quickly became apparent that his body was racked with battle injuries. A time capsule had been opened, showing the last moments of Richard's bloody fight at Bosworth, the king's head shaved by the glancing blows from a halberd or sword, the back of his skull completely cleaved off by a halberd, a two-handled pole weapon, consisting of an axe blade tipped in a spike. And then, as his face was powerfully reconstructed from the skeletal structure around it, we at last had the opportunity to see him as he really was. This is the story of one of history's most infamous kings, now restored to us, and the man behind the Tudor myth. Philippa Langley and Michael Jones, July 2013. Introduction. The Inspiration. I suppose I had always known about Richard. Shakespeare's villain must have registered somewhere in the recesses of my mind, but he didn't strike a chord with me. When I was growing up in the northern market town of Darlington, history had been my favourite subject. We had studied the Viking period through to 1066, our teacher bringing history vividly to life, and I'd revelled in the characters that formed our island nation. Oddly enough, we were never taught about Richard III and the Wars of the Roses, the conflict that tore the country apart. And there was another mystery that I discovered years later. Richard, Duke of Gloucester's home at Middleham Castle, lay a short drive away, yet there had been no school trips to see the history right on our doorstep. I began to take an interest in Richard after I read Paul Murray Kendall's biography, Richard III, in which he questioned Shakespeare's interpretation of the king, proposing a different character altogether. Kendall drew on the testimonies of those who had known Richard intimately, such as the city fathers of York, who the day after Richard's death at Bosworth had written, "King Richard, late mercifully reigning upon us, was piteously slain and murdered, to the great heaviness of this city," noting he was "the most famous prince of blessed memory." Richard's life had everything: politics, power, romance, intrigue, mystery, murder, self-sacrifice, loyalty, and incredible acts of bravery. I was intrigued to know more about the man, and why it had been so necessary for the Tudors to rewrite his story. As I learned more about him, I was puzzled as to why Richard had always been represented one-dimensionally on screen. The malevolent, crooked Shakespearean figure has been rolled out since the dawning of the film industry, with Hollywood portraying a tyrant in its first-ever full-length feature film, Richard III, in 1912. No one seemed interested in rendering a more complex, nuanced portrait, while, perversely, Tudor history has been extensively filmed, television companies favouring exciting modern dramas about the Tudor monarchs who succeeded Richard III. The Six Wives of Henry VIII, starring Keith Michell, was screened in 1970, quickly followed by Glenda Jackson's Elizabeth R., and many other similar programmes. It would seem that little has changed today. HBO's critically acclaimed Game of Thrones is loosely based on the Wars of the Roses, but is a fantasy, and the BBC has a forthcoming modern glossy series about the women of this period, The White Queen, adapted from Philippa Gregory's trilogy, with Richard sidelined to a supporting role. Cinema, too, has recounted almost every story concerning the Tudors, but has yet to bring the actual Richard to life. I was baffled by the industry's apparent desire to avoid putting King Richard III's more subtle persona centre stage on the screen. Was this because of a general lack of interest in the character, or something more profound? Perhaps Richard was too complex, and it was too difficult to find his voice. Or perhaps the establishment was happy to maintain the Tudor version of his story, in which case there was little need to reinterpret his life. After all, Shakespeare had already presented the Tudor account. Many modern works claiming to reveal the real King Richard were simply rehashes of the Tudor Richard. Villains sell. Some independent voices using contemporary sources who had known Richard described a different man, but they were lost among the Tudor histories. However, I was persuaded by the evidence for the real human Richard. By now I had joined the Richard III Society, the oldest and largest historical society in the world. Its Ricardian statement of intent resonated with the many features of the traditional accounts of the character and career of Richard III, being neither supported by a sufficient evidence nor reasonably tenable. Since 1924, its work has provided the platform for leading research on the man and his times. Moreover, the view of the Society's patron, the Duke of Gloucester, and his moving dedication address in 1980 in defence of something as esoteric and fragile as reputation captivated me. I started to write my own screenplay about Richard, but try as I might, I couldn't make the Richard I'd found in all the primary sources square with all the deeds he was supposed to have done. I could portray Richard, the loyal, dutiful son and brother living happily in the north, undertaking the tasks he is known to have performed there, and this matched what I knew about his character. But I couldn't make the quantum leap of propelling him onto the throne. I was confronted by a giant jigsaw puzzle, where many pieces fitted together easily, reflecting Richard's character, but the key moments remained opaque. King Richard III was an enigma. I was by no means the first writer to have this problem. There are many accounts of historians being unable to understand his actions at important points, particularly in 1483 when he took the throne. But I was approaching him from a different perspective. I had to be familiar with his character before I could put into context the many challenges of his life, rather than the other way round. The later events of Richard's life did not define him. His character had been formed before they took place. I wasn't interested in creating a saintly one-dimensional figure. That would have been as nonsensical as the sinister person presented to us for so long. And yet I couldn't make sense of the jigsaw before me. I was about to give up when a new book on Richard was published. Bosworth, 1485, Psychology of a Battle, by the historian Michael Jones, and co-author of this book. It was acclaimed as a seminal work on the battle itself and on Richard's character, placing him in the context of his family, unlike Shakespeare and the Tudor writers who had separated him from it. But what changed everything for me in Bosworth 1485 was the startling new evidence relating to Richard and his family, and new insight into the battle that would come to define him. The jigsaw of Richard's life and its key moments were beginning to come together. By this time I had formed the Scottish branch of the Richard III Society, and was keen to meet this writer to hear about his research and his new evidence. When we met, we discovered that we shared a similar view of Richard and the pivotal events of his life. With Michael Jones's book underpinning my screenplay, I immersed myself in the world of Richard III, devouring all I could on the king, visiting every place that had held meaning for him. In May 2004, my initial research complete, I travelled to the site of the Battle of Bosworth, which was both affecting and fascinating. The lie of the land in this small corner of Leicestershire seemed to suggest a battle fought over a much wider area than previously realised. After Bosworth, I headed to Leicester. I wanted to explore the city and see it as Richard might have done, to view the remains of the castle, visit the site of the Blue Boar Inn, walk the Western Gateway, and cross Bow Bridge over the River Soar, returning via Richard's statue and the cathedral, and, finally, to the New Street car park, where it was rumoured that Richard's grave might once have been from a fragment of medieval wall that remained there. After visiting the cathedral and laying my Yorkist white rose on the ledger stone to his memory in the choir, I wandered over to New Street, a small lane opposite. As I crossed St. Martin's, the street names around it bore witness to the friary precinct that had once existed nearby. Richard had reputedly been buried in the church of the Greyfriars in 1485. Friar Lane ran along New Street's southern end, with Greyfriars Street running off to the east. New Street car park is a tarmacked expanse of wasteland, accommodating 100 or so vehicles. That warm afternoon it lay almost empty and quiet, giving me the opportunity to walk its length and ponder what might lie beneath the unpromising surface. As I approached the parking attendant's hut by an old beech tree, I could see the section of medieval stonework lodged in the wall. I tried to get a feel for what it would have been like in Richard's day, how it might have looked, but nothing remained here of the past. I felt no resonance with Richard's life or death. Leaving New Street to head home, I spotted another car park almost directly opposite. I hadn't noticed it before, but I'd been so intent on getting to the first car park that I must have walked straight past it. This one had high green gates with a barrier over the entrance and a sign marked "Private." I was going to move on, but experienced an overwhelming urge to enter. I slid around the barrier and into the car park, which again was pretty much deserted, apart from a few scattered vehicles. It was a large open space for 70 or more vehicles, surrounded by Georgian buildings, with a large red-brick Victorian wall running north to south straight ahead of me. I found myself drawn to this wall, and as I walked towards it, I was aware of a strange sensation. My heart was pounding, and my mouth was dry. It was a feeling of raw excitement tinged with fear. As I got near the wall, I had to stop. I felt so odd. I had goosebumps, so much that even in the sunshine I felt cold to my bones. And I knew in my innermost being that Richard's body lay here. Moreover, I was certain that I was standing right on top of his grave. Back home, and trying to comprehend what I had experienced, friends and family told me not to dismiss it. A year later, after completing the first draft of my screenplay, I returned to the car park, questioning if what I had felt that day had been real. As I walked to the same spot and looked at the Victorian wall, the goosebumps reappeared. I stared down at my feet. Slightly to my left on the tarmac there was something new. A white, hand-painted letter R, denoting a reserved parking spot, but it told me all I needed to know. My return visit to a Leicester car park was intended to mark the end of my investigation into Richard's story, but would now mark the beginning of an entirely new search to uncover the real Richard III. My quest for the king's grave had started. 1. The Road to the Dig. If my gut instinct was correct, how did the medieval Greyfriars church become a modern car park? Most historical sources agreed that following his death in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth, King Richard III had been buried at the Church of the Greyfriars in Leicester, and 10 years later Henry VII had paid for a tomb. Further investigation revealed that in 1538, at the dissolution of the monasteries, the church was closed and fell into ruins. By 1611, the map-maker John Speed reported the place was overgrown with nettles and weeds, and King Richard's grave not to be found. But it is also known that Robert Herrick, a former mayor of Leicester, had bought part of the Greyfriars site and built himself a mansion. In 1612, Christopher Wren, father of the famous architect, noted that in Herrick's garden there was a handsome stone pillar, 3 feet tall, inscribed with, "Here lies the body of Richard III, sometime King of England." The Greyfriars site subsequently passed through several owners until in the early 20th century it was tarmacked over to become car parks. Later, part of it was sold to Leicester City Council Social Services Department, and it had been in its car park that I had had my unsettling experience. As I continued to flesh out Richard's character for revised drafts of my screenplay, the conclusion to his story started to frustrate me. He was the last English warrior king, but had no known grave. Any search for that grave would be fanciful and irrational, particularly since stories abounded about his bones being removed at the dissolution of the monasteries and thrown into the River Soar. There was also the question mark over the Greyfriars church. Where was it? Furthermore, supposing human remains were found, how could they be identified as those of Richard III? Then everything changed. Dr. John Ashdown Hill, historian, genealogist, and member of the Richard III Society, made a most remarkable discovery. Having traced an all-female line of descent from Richard's elder sister, Anne of York, to Joy Ibsen, an elderly lady living in Canada, he identified King Richard's mitochondrial DNA sequence. It was a rare one. Only 17% of the population had haplogroup J for Jasmine, but further, only 1.5% had this particular haplotype, J1C2C. The science was compelling. Female mitochondria are the most plentiful DNA in the human body. Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, is the hereditary material present in all cells of living organisms and the main ingredient of our chromosomes, giving us our distinctive genetic characteristics. We each receive our mitochondrial DNA from our mother, but it is only passed on through the female line from mother to daughter. Having the mitochondrial DNA sequence of Richard III was crucial, since it represented the best opportunity for the survival of DNA within ancient remains because of its quantity, and also offered the greatest potential for a positive identification. The fact that it was a rare type of mitochondrial DNA was an added bonus. In addition, the female line of descent is generally considered more trustworthy than the male, because the official, named mother of a child is usually the child's authentic biological mother. But how and why had the DNA discovery come about? Ashdown Hill had been working with leading DNA expert Professor Jean-Jacques Cassiman at the Centre for Human Genetics, University of Leuven, Belgium, to try to establish whether bones found in Mechlin in the mid-20th century could be the remains of Margaret of Burgundy, 1446 to 1503, an elder sister of Richard III. In the mid-20th century, 3 sets of bones had been discovered, and Ashdown Hill's research had concluded that one of these might be those of Margaret. He now needed to compare Joy Ibsen's mitochondrial DNA with that in the ancient bones. A match would confirm the remains as those of Richard's sister. There was only one problem. Some time in the past, one set of bones had been coated with varnish as a preservative, making it impossible to isolate DNA, while the other sets may have been contaminated by handling over the years. Although Ashdown Hill was unable to extrapolate the ancient mitochondrial DNA from the Meckellan bones to identify them, it was a game-changing discovery. I now knew that if we did go in search of King Richard's body, we would be able to identify him. In autumn 2005, I contacted Ashdown Hill and suggested he write to Time Team, the archaeological TV show, proposing a search for Richard's grave in the Social Services car park. Time Team replied that their 3-day dig format was not compatible with a search of such a large area. Of course, I couldn't tell them, or Ashdown Hill, why I felt that 3 days might just be enough. Then, in late summer 2007, an archaeological excavation took place in Greyfriars Street in Leicester, where a small single-storey 1950s extension at the NatWest Pears Bank site was being demolished to make way for a block of flats. Undertaking the archaeology was University of Leicester Archaeological Services, ULAS, and what they discovered, or more precisely, what they did not discover, changed my plans irrevocably. The dig was in the Greyfriars area, but the only find that suggested there might have been a medieval church in the vicinity was a fragment of a stone coffin lid found in a post-medieval drain. The dig was dismissed locally as of little importance, but I disagreed. It suggested that the Greyfriars Church was located further to the west of the Greyfriars area than had been assumed, away from the heavily developed eastern part towards the car parks, open spaces ripe for archaeological investigation. I wrote to Leicester City Council's archaeologist, Chris Wardle, requesting further information on the dig, but received no response. However, after I encouraged the Richard III Society to make contact, Wardle was persuaded to write an article for the Society's Ricardian Bulletin, which gave me a much clearer picture of the Greyfriars area. It had previously been asserted that Richard might first have been buried at the Church of the Annunciation in the Newark in Leicester, but in 2008 John Ashdown Hill found more evidence to support the Greyfriars church burial. And in her book Richard III, The Maligned King, Annette Carson examined sources contemporary with Richard III, that is, pre-Tudor, with the aim of uncovering the man behind the myth, and proved that it was possible to discover the king's real character. The Maligned King suggested that the king probably still lay undisturbed where he was originally buried in the Greyfriars Church, which was most likely situated under the private car park of the Department of Social Services. It was the first book I had read to make this claim. The next piece in the jigsaw once more came from John Ashdown Hill. While researching Richard's burial, he discovered that it was John Speed who had started the story about the removal of Richard's remains as a means of explaining why he could find no trace of Richard's grave. But Speed's map showed that he had been looking for the grave in the wrong place. He had been looking in the Blackfriars, Dominican site, not the Greyfriars, Franciscans, and it was the Blackfriars site he had reported as overgrown with nettles and weeds. Ashdown Hill concluded that the body of Richard III had not been dug up in 1538, and was therefore still at the Greyfriars site. So the question remained, where was the Greyfriars church? The street names and the recent dig in Greyfriars Street appeared to confirm my instinct that the burial place was on the northern side of the Social Services car park, where I had had my experience. But I needed evidence, without which no one could be expected to take me seriously. Then, researching in the Richard III Society's archives, I found a copy of a medieval map from Leicestershire County Council records. This showed the Greyfriars Church opposite St. Martin.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?